First, my name is Brian Fields. I'm the president of Pennsylvania Nonbelievers. Our organization, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, have worked together to put together this afternoon with Dr. Ellery Schempp. Before we get started with that, however, we also would like to point out that the reason for this event is the 50th anniversary of the court case that took out compulsory prayer and scripture reading in schools. Those cases were Abington v. Schempp and Murray versus Curlett in 1963. It was one decision and they were decided together. But connected with that, I'd like to first introduce I'd like to introduce David Messler who works with Americans United to say a few words about this event.
Well, my remarks will be very short, as they should be. I want to say, first of all, that on behalf of the Interfaith Alliance, we are very grateful to our friends in the ACLU and Pennsylvania Nonbelievers and for having this event, and especially grateful to Dr. Schempp for his role in this historic decision. All of us in this field of effort worry about the theocratic tendencies in the American electorate. And Dr. Schempp struck an early and decisive blow in favor of religious freedom, freedom for everyone, religious and otherwise. And so we are very grateful, and on behalf of the Interfaith Alliance, thank you.
Hi, my name is Laurie Lebo, and I'm active in the ACLU. And I just wanted to, I know that I talk to people a lot who say, well, what's the big deal about these cases? Why are they important? Why, should we care? And I heard a gentleman a couple weeks ago who said, he told a story about why Dr. Schempp's case mattered so much to him, and he said that he was looking forward to coming today because he wanted to shake his hand and thank him for what he did because of his situation. And his name is Turk, and he's going to tell the story about why this case mattered so much to him. So Turk, thank you so much.
I'd like to begin by thanking the ACLU and Pennsylvania Nonbelievers for allowing me the privilege of introducing our guest today. For me, it is a privilege because of personal experiences. My father was a career man in the military. And in 1962, he was given a one-year assignment in the Aleutian Islands, a place where he couldn't take his family. My mom decided she wanted to come to PA and spend that year with her mother and her sisters. So during the midterm of the 1962 school year, I transferred from a small school in California that did not have school prayer or school paddling to a school in western Pennsylvania that had both. On the first day of my school year in Pennsylvania, I sat down at my desk, waiting for the day to start. All of a sudden, the bell rang. Everybody stood up and started reciting a prayer. Bizarre. I wasn't sure what was expected here, but being the reasonably tolerant person that I am, I politely turned aside to give them a little privacy. And then I absently picked up a piece of chalk and started doodling on the blackboard next to my desk. That's when I discovered school paddling. I was suddenly confronted by a very angry teacher who drugged me up front, pulled out a 4-foot-long cudgel, gave me a whack on my butt, sent me to the principal's office. For the rest of that school term, that became my daily ritual. Every morning, the teacher would formally ask me if I would join the class in their devotions. I said no, received my whack, and went to the principal's office while the rest of the students said their meaningless and somewhat robotic prayer. The school sent my mom a letter, and my mom, my grandmother, 2 cousins, and an aunt all tried to talk me out of this stance that I was taking. Hell, my ass tried to talk me out of it. Seriously, have you ever had a conversation with your own butt? It's weird. Dining school ended the term, had a nice summer. On the first day of the next term, 1963, I went to school dreading the term, sat down at my desk, organized my gear, then I just went up front and assumed the position over the teacher's desk. While I was waiting, something magical happened. A miracle. A voice came over the intercom and announced that because of a June decision by the Supreme Court, there would be no more school prayers. Everybody stood up and cheered. I have to tell you, I strutted the hallways like it was my victory. Indeed it was. I was vindicated. So what was all this about? Well, another young man, standing for his beliefs and conscience, in 1958, 1956, decided to stage a protest against school devotions. Dr. Ellery Schempp was born in Philadelphia, grew up in the suburban township of Abington. He graduated from Abington High School in 1958. In 1963, his family continued to fight through the court system, the federal court system. And in 1963, 5 years after Dr. Schempp graduated, the Supreme Court decided by an 8-to-1 margin, by an 8-to-1 majority, sorry about that, that school devotions were unconstitutional. Dr. Schempp attended Tufts University in Medford, Maryland. No, Medford, Massachusetts. Sorry about that. Where he received a bachelor's in physics. He then attended in Rhode Island to Providence, Rhode Island, where he received his PhD in physics. Dr. Schempp was employed at Bell Telephone Labs in New Jersey, the University of Pittsburgh, Geneva University in Switzerland, the Lawrence Berkeley Labs in California, General Electric Medical Systems, and American Superconductor. At GE, he worked on the developing emerging technology of MRI. Dr. Schempp has been to the Antarctic. He's been to Greenland. He was a member of the Pittsburgh expedition to Nanga Parbat in Pakistan. That's the 9th largest mountain in the world. He's now retired. He lives in Massachusetts near Boston with his partner, Arlene Germain. And he remains active in church-state issues. Dr. Schempp, I would like to extend to you a warm, heartfelt, personal thank you for the day the Watkins died. And on this 50th anniversary of Abington School District versus Schempp, it's my pleasure as well as my privilege to introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ellery Schempp.
I think the kind of courage that he displayed exceeds far from anything that I had to endure. So I want to thank you indeed for being important to remember that behind every one of these court cases, there are real people and real persons and real issues that affect individuals. And it's not that the ACLU goes around looking for places to make trouble, but they try to defend people who are already in trouble. And people like Turk deserve what was able to be accomplished using the court system. Now I see that Turk has taken away one of the first pages of my notes.
And he shredded it.
And you'll notice that after that warm welcome, I don't do all that well in warm weather. I think it comes from... That's okay. I can add that. I will. I suppose it comes from the time when so many people wish me to get to hell in a hurry. So I'm thinking that maybe this warm weather makes me feel entirely too uncomfortable with that close connection. I do want to mention that you didn't mention, Turk and Lori, that I was born in 1940. I was born only once. My mother was actually there, and she had no intention of having me born again. And when we come to this issue of school prayer and whatever, sometimes I actually start with a lecture by saying, well, let us pray. And then I wait for nervous giggles around the room. It's amazing the power of that little phrase, let us pray, and how we immediately sort of become compliant. We're so conditioned for it. But one of the things I think that's overlooked is that when school kids get together for prayer, even particularly silent prayer, it's often, nobody ever thinks about what they're actually praying for. Now, you can imagine that, very active adolescent teenagers have got a lot of things on their mind. And what they pray for may not be at all what the pastor has in his mind. Well, we all know the wall of separation, the phrase "the wall of separation of church and state" due to Thomas Jefferson. It's interesting to know that it was actually Roger Williams in Rhode Island who first wrote about a garden wall separating the beauty of government from the faith of religion. And it was from Roger Williams, actually, that Thomas Jefferson came up with the phrase of a wall of separation between church and state. But let's consider the Constitution, which was written in 1787 and ratified with the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, passed in 1791. Let me tell you, there was nothing in the Constitution about the Bible, and there is nothing in the Bible about democracy or our Constitution. Our Constitution mentions God. Our Constitution never mentions God or Christianity or any commandments. It is a purely humanistic document. The preamble, of course, begins, "We the people do ordain and establish." Our Constitution mentions religion just twice, and both times the word "no" is attached. The first mention is in Article 6, "No religious test shall ever be required," and the second, of course, is in the First Amendment, in the Bill of Rights, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." The Constitution is a religiously neutral, secular, and political document. No founding father thought the idea of an independent judiciary or 3 branches of government came from divine revelation. The oath of office in Article 2 does not contain the words, "So help me God." This is a phrase that started to be used only in recent years. The word God does not appear anyplace in the Constitution. And the Constitution says nothing about a Bible for taking an oath. In fact, the words in the Constitution are to swear or affirm. This is because the word swear had religious meanings at that time 200 years ago. So our founders recognized that there should be a non-religious commitment by the use of the word affirming. Sometimes fun to quote Jeremy Raskin, a legislator in Maryland, who said, "I put my hand on the Bible and swore to uphold the Constitution. I did not put my hand on the Constitution to swear to uphold the Bible." And note that the Declaration of Independence, which refers to our unalienable rights endowed by our Creator, the Declaration of Independence is not any part of U.S. law. This language was intended to counter the so-called divine right of kings, but it has no legal standing whatsoever. No Supreme Court case or any other court case has ever relied on the Declaration of Independence as its authority. Some of our right-wing friends assert that the Bible is the underpinning of America. So I asked them, where in the Bible does the word democracy appear? The Bible never once mentions freedom of speech, or even freedom of religion, or elections, or anything related to democratic freedoms and values. The Bible, neither the Old Testament nor the New Testament, never once mentions a democracy, a republic, or anything related to American values. There is no Bill of Rights in the Bible, and Bible believers cannot find anything referring to tolerance of other religions, because it's not there. The Bible provides no model for good government or for personal freedoms. It is a purely religious and theological document. So it seems to me that Bible reading and prayer in the schools do not promote American civic or patriotic values at all. Moreover, considering the violence, the murders, the rapes, even of children, it is clear that the Bible is a book unfit for children. The God of Noah's flood is utterly ridiculous, because in a fit of pique, he destroys everything, including, I might add, zillions of unborn fetuses. And from a democracy viewpoint, religious officials and promoters are not elected, they take no oath of office for the Constitution, and they do not have to account for their money. Religious leaders have always tried to capture the power of government, of course, to promote their own self-interest and their agendas, and often to get rich. I began thinking about the Constitution and the Bible way back in 1956. I was a 16-year-old in the 11th grade in the Abington Senior High School, a suburb of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania had a law that required 10 verses of the Bible to be read, without comment, in every school classroom at the beginning of each school day. This was followed by the students standing to recite the Lord's Prayer and the flag salute. And 20 or 30 states had similar laws. And as Turk mentioned, this daily ceremony was known as morning devotions. It seemed to me that this established, or preferred at least, a Christian religious practice in the schools, under the authority of the government. I actually read the First Amendment. It is only 45 words long and not taxing even for teenagers. On the Monday after a Thanksgiving weekend, I brought a copy of the Koran to school. I wanted to show that there were other holy books, and the Bible was not unique. The Koran was merely by accident, but my friend's father had a copy in his library. It could just as easily have been some Hindu or Buddhist scripture. But the school rule was that during Bible reading, kids were required to put away all other material and listen and pay attention. And on that morning, I disobeyed the rule by opening the Koran and reading it, silently, and I might say rather nervously, but I did not stand for the Lord's Prayer. Therefore, the reaction was swift. My homeroom teacher confronted me, and I replied that, as a matter of religious conscience, I could no longer participate in these devotions. He was tongue-tied, but he knew disobedience when he saw it. So he sent me to the school principal. He was equally dumbfounded when I said I thought these devotions violated the First Amendment. He waved his arms in a wide sweep and said there were 1,300 other students here and was a matter of me showing respect. Well, I had good grades, so my being in front of him introduced cognitive dissonance, big time. Since I didn't fit the mold, he sent me to the guidance counselor, who inquired about my family life and whatever troubles I might be having. Perhaps I had a conflict with authority and my father. No, I said, I simply had a disagreement about Bible reading. Yes, I was confident of their support. That evening over dinner, I reported on the day's events to my folks, and my dad suggested I write to the ACLU. That letter was long forgotten, but Steve Solomon, the author of this book, which I highly recommend, Ellery's Protest, I'm not the author, I didn't choose the title, but I can say that it's an extremely excellent account of all the events that led up to this and the court issues, the legal issues and many other things that it's fun to read about. The letter that I wrote, he found a copy in the National Archives of all places. I typed it out on my dad's typewriter with 2 fingers. Some of you are old enough to remember typewriters.
Yes.
The letter I wrote to the ACLU in Philadelphia said, November 26, 1956, Gentlemen, as a student in my junior year at Abington Senior High School, I would very greatly appreciate any information you might send regarding possible union action and/or aid in testing the constitutionality of Pennsylvania law, which arbitrarily and seemingly unrighteously and unconstitutionally compels the Bible to be read in our public school system. I thank you for any help you might offer in freeing American youth in Pennsylvania from this gross violation of their religious rights as guaranteed in the First and Foremost Amendment in our United States Constitution. Sincerely yours, Ellery Schempp. Well, speaking for American youth was rather pretentious indeed. I was 16 years old then, and since then I've learned to write shorter sentences. But I also enclosed a $10 bill. That's probably about $100 in today's money, and this got the ACLU's attention. If a kid can save this sum from his allowance in grass cutting, he might be serious. Well, I was lucky to grow up in a family that knew about the ACLU and were members of a Unitarian church. The Unitarian Church in Germantown, Philadelphia, had an amazing pulpit roster where Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Norman Thomas, and others spoke regularly. We were quite an ordinary family living in the suburbs, except for this. But why did I object? There were several reasons. Fairness was one of the first ones. I thought that schools needed to be fair to everyone. The Bible is not the holy book of Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims, so that is an unfairness. Non-believers going to school to learn history and math should not have Bible or prayer forced on them. I remember my Jewish friends were made uncomfortable by certain passages, and I noticed that Catholic kids did not say the same Lord's Prayer. You know, there's a Douay version of the Bible. It contains different books and a different version of the 10 Commandments. I rejected the notion that there was one universal truth. I saw that the school was being a missionary for one sectarian kind of Christian belief and trying to suppress all others. It also seemed to me obvious that the Bible is not a source of morality, as the school claimed. I mean, I got to thinking, which is always a bit dangerous. I knew that kids in Oregon and other states did not have Bible reading. Could it be true that they were less moral than those of us in Abington? This brought out the lie, of course. The Bible contains passages that are in direct contradiction to science as well. Scientifically, it is impossible to believe in Noah's flood. This is a story with no moral or scientific value. There are so many accounts of creation in various traditions, so the Genesis account and the Noah's flood myths are simply one among many. I rejected the notion that the Bible account has any authority. I disbelieve in talking snakes too, or I used to, but then Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin came along. And I could see that rituals imposed on 7-year-olds are an unfairness. In the Abington decision, the court recognized that children are particularly vulnerable and deserve particular protection for their developing thoughts as to their freedom of beliefs, without coercion from a majority or a dominant religious faith. And being excused from these classroom devotions is not an effective answer. That requires self-identity as a dissenter or a non-believer and opens the door to discrimination, taunting, and perhaps bullying. One of the important phrases in the Supreme Court decision was that children are not noted for their resistance to the forces of social suasion. And that reminds us that coercion can be subtle. And the Bible reading was just silly, of course. In the younger grades, the teacher would read the Bible. By junior high school, teachers turned it over to the pupils to do it in rotation. Hardly anybody remembered when it was their turn. All you had to do was get to the front of the room, find a Bible, which was always called the Holy Bible, but in practice turned out to be always the King James Version. And you opened it at random, you stumbled through 10 verses, and you were done. And anyone who has seen a class of 2nd or 3rd graders, you know you can get them to pray or to pledge. That is, they stand up, they mumble, they sit down, they've done their duty. I recall that one kid started reading the begats. You know, there's a lot of begetting going on in the Bible, although this is often overlooked in Sunday school. Anyway, the next day another kid carried on, and so on, until finally the teacher said enough. I'm sure that all this begetting created worries about abstinence only. Bible reading and prayer were supposed to fill us with some inspiration for the tasks ahead that day, according to the lawyers for the school board. Indeed, I do recall some inspiration. On my next turn to read, I chose verses from the Song of Solomon. Thy breasts are like 2 doves in the morning dew. This was pretty heady stuff for 14-year-olds, at least in 1956, especially when sanctioned by the school. And then came, King Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines. Since at the time I aspired to having only a single girlfriend, this was distinctly inspiring. Well, going back to 1956, you know, that was in the midst of the McCarthy era, when every dissent was labeled communist or worse. But the Supreme Court in 1954 decided that segregation was a violation of the Constitution, and I thought this was a wonderful affirmation of human rights and social justice. And this influenced me to think that this applies to religious minorities as well. 1956, when to conform was the greatest goal. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was a popular book at the time, and Abington embraced this notion that you should conform in every way. And in 1954, the phrase "under God" was added to the pledge. You know, it's quite amazing that none of our founding fathers ever recited the Pledge of Allegiance, nor did Abraham Lincoln. It was only written in 1896 by Francis Bellamy, a minister with socialist leanings, and was only widely used after World War I. When I hear that under God is essential to our well-being, I ask, how could it be that the United States survived for 100 years without this pledge? And the phrase "under God" was added only in 1954 at the urging of the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic group that favors Vatican-based government. The entire Congress marched out to the Capitol steps to recite the new pledge while singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." I always wonder again, however did the U.S. manage to win World War II before we had "under God" in the pledge? Well, you should recognize that we are not under God. You can see on a map that we're actually under Canada. And in 1955, Playboy published its first issue. Now, as a teenage scholarly boy, I had little interest except for the articles. But I noticed that the Bible thumpers were outraged and wanted to stop it. I felt it my civic duty to stand up for Playboy. I mean, in a conflict between Bible and Playboy, the Bible had to go. So after many months of visiting our family and discussion, the ACLU, with much deliberation, agreed to provide legal support. And we argued in court that the Bible reading was a violation of the First and 14th Amendments. The 14th Amendment is critical. Many people don't realize that, because it is interpreted to mean that the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment, applies to the states as well as to the Congress. This is very well described in the book by Stephen Solomon. A similar case was brought by Madalyn Murray, who later became O'Hair, in the state of Maryland in 1960. And these two cases reached the Supreme Court at the same time, and so they were consolidated or joined. Murray founded the group called American Atheist, and she became famous as an outspoken atheist. Was featured on the cover of Life magazine as the most hated woman in America. Very sadly, Murray, her son Garth, and daughter Robin were brutally murdered in 1996. So in June of 1963, the Supreme Court issued a decision in the case of Abington versus Schempp and Murray versus Curley, in an 8-1 decision, as Turk mentioned. The court ruled that these Bible reading and prayers in public schools violated the United States Constitution. And this changed the laws in about 32 states. Bible reading as a devotional, ceremonial practice stopped. If you didn't pray in schools, it was because of this. Well, this made national news. There was an outrage on a grand scale. You might say it was of biblical proportions. I have a lot of cousins, and suddenly everyone had an identity crisis. Can we change our names? Oh, that's my crazy uncle. No, those are some other Schempps. We don't know them. President Kennedy tried to calm the country in that June of 1963 by saying, "I'm sure that we can all pray a bit more at home and in our churches and in our synagogues." And there's a wonderful, my partner Arlene has put together some of the memorabilia over here, some of the letters that we got and some of the cartoons. There's a wonderful cartoon by Herblock that shows the father sitting at the breakfast table, reading a copy of the New York Times of the 8-1 decision about prayer, demanding to know, what did the Supreme Court want us to do? Listen to the kids pray at home? But Senator Eastland from Mississippi fulminated. The Supreme Court put the niggers in and threw God out. That's a quote. Well, we didn't suffer as much as Madalyn Murray's family because we were members of a church. Nobody knew exactly what kind of church, but it sounded good. And if Unitarians had had pagodas, it would have been different. But my brother Roger was kicked around a few times. Kids would roll down the windows of the school bus and shout out, "Now passing the commie camp." Dog poo was thrown on our porch. My sister Donna was mortified, and some parents told their daughters not to play with her. I later learned that the principal of my high school wrote letters of disrecommendation to every college that I applied to. In fact, I learned that he actually called long distance to demand that Tufts rescind their letter of admittance. We lived in Roslyn, part of Abington Township, on Susquehanna Road. That's when I learned how to spell Susquehanna at the age of 5 or 6. And a few years ago, we revisited the old homestead and discovered that 2459 Susquehanna Road no longer exists. The house and subsequent owners received so much mail over the years that they petitioned the post office and the school and the local town to renumber the houses along the street. So the house numbers now jump from 2457 to 2461. 2469 no longer exists. For myself, I was always perplexed that prayer in schools was so important. And senators and House members stood in line to file amendments to put prayer back in the schools. Hearings were held, 400 pages of testimony and speechifying. And some of these copies are of these hearings before the Congress were available here to look at. In fact, every single year for the last 50, a constitutional amendment has been proposed to overturn the Abington case and the earlier Engel case. Every 5 to 10 years or so, one comes up for a vote, actually, and usually wins a majority. But fortunately, so far, not one has won the 2/3 majority needed to actually propose the constitutional amendment. We received about 5,000 letters, roughly 1/3 supporting us, 1/3 opposing in reasonable terms, and 1/3, as you might expect, hateful and vituperative. Many of the letters in support mention the book of Matthew, chapter 6, where Jesus is quoted as that you should not pray for public display as the hypocrites do, seeking public approval and not using vain repetitions. That passage is usually forgotten by Christians. My parents answered every letter that had a return address, and this was in the days before Xerox machines and when stamps cost 3.5 cents. Still came to hundreds of dollars. But the amusing thing was we were accused of being everything the writer hated. So we expected the letters, what are you, commies? What are you, Nazis? What are you, Catholics? What are you, Jews? We didn't expect the ones that said, what are you, Methodists? And then there were the amusing ones that said, in the name of Christ, go to hell.
Yeah.
I don't recall any letter that accusingly asked, what are you, Zoroastrians? I conclude that nobody hates Zoroastrians, and you might want to look into that. One of the things we learned was that in the United States it was considered bad not to be Christian, of course. It was very bad to be a communist. But it was really quite awful to be an atheist. When people called us, you communist atheists, they had reached their ultimate in outrage. Atheists are the most feared, and therefore most hated, group in America. Fear and hate often go hand in hand. We got many letters about what I call the missionary position. Many people who protested the Supreme Court's decision said, well, if it weren't for prayers in the schools, many kids would never hear about Christ or God, or Allah. What an absurd idea. But so what? What is the source of this notion that everyone has to be introduced to Christ or to Allah in order that their souls might be saved? I think if believers are happy with their souls, why not leave mine alone? The right to privacy, to be left alone by government and police, is an important constitutional liberty. And let me mention that liberal and liberties have the same root. Well, I cannot do justice to all the separation of church and state cases in these few minutes, but I would like to mention the names of, that these are not just abstractions, as I was saying before. These are real people. I wish we could all spend a little moment to think about the personal fortitude, the sacrifice and hardship that each one of these people in the McCullum and Weissman, Engel, Torcaso, and other Everson cases endured. Individuals who are the sole voice, standing alone, sometimes threatened with personal harm. Parents taking on the wrath of their community to protect their children from injustices. And children facing ostracism and losing a normal childhood. And this is what the ACLU has done for us. And Americans United, and the Freedom of Religion Foundation, American Humanists, and many other really very good organizations. And I give credit to the justices who considered and wrote the opinions. I am forever amazed by the quality of opinions that are written, even those that I disagree with. And the lawyers who wrote the briefs and argued the cases, they get far too little credit. In the case of Schempp, our lawyer, Henry Sawyer, served pro bono for the ACLU and spent a year in researching and thinking. It's a damn shame that the case is not known as Sawyer, and similarly with the other cases. Well, for 200 years or so, it was common practice in most schools to have some sort of Bible reading and prayer in the morning. These morning devotions arose out of our history. After all, the idea of universal education was a relatively new idea that took firm root in the era of the Enlightenment, around the time of 1776 and 1820. The idea of being educated, that is to be able to read and write, have some knowledge about nature, knowing something about the wider world outside one's own village, this was a radical idea when applied to the common man. The First Amendment is clear. There shall be no intertwining of government and religion. But you can have all the personal beliefs you want. You can believe in psychics, magnetic bracelets, in Zeus or Jupiter, and Venus or Aphrodite, fairies and pixies, praying and rituals, all to your heart's content. But you have no right to get any government to help you impose your views on the rest of us. And I remind people that public prayer is not intended to promote religious values, but to enhance the authority of some churches and some political views over others. Similarly with the posting of the Ten Commandments. It is about power, not about religion. And the Constitution clearly intends that there should be freedom from religion as well. Government is to be free from religious interference. It's clear because the Constitution makes no provision for any church or religion to have any official role whatsoever. Our Constitution and our government do not depend on any divine blessing. The school authorities argued at length that Bible reading was vital to instilling moral values. They even went so far with this as to claim that the Bible was not a religious book. But what about these moral values? I note that when Catholics and Protestants talk about morality, They actually just mean sex. But no writer in biblical times had the slightest clue about sperm or ova or genetics. You might find it amusing that the human egg was only discovered in 1827 in St. Petersburg by Ernst von Brauer. And after all, it is largely religious dogma that opposes gay marriage and the rights of women. It was religious dogma that made contraception illegal. It is religious dogma that promotes circumcision and genital mutilation. It is religious dogma that promotes abstinence and categorizes masturbation as sin. There is something truly weird about a religious worldview that makes sexual orgasms a matter of sin or morality. You know, only 100 years ago, it was a religious dogma that declared that women were morally unfit to vote. And it is religious doctrine that aims to discredit evolution and insert intelligent design or creationism in the schools in the place of sound science. The Ten Commandments? Well, the first 5 are about a God belief and have no moral or ethical content whatsoever. I do not see the Ten Commandments as showing the slightest concern for children or family values or for freedom of conscience. Our laws are clearly based on economic capitalism and humanistic values. I don't think there's anyone who actually thinks that our tax laws and Medicare laws are based on the Ten Commandments. And religion by rote does not promote spiritual values, nor does constant repetition of the pledge promote patriotic or civic values. As I mentioned, public prayer is not intended to promote religious values, but to enhance the authority of some churches. Public displays of piety are about power. To my view, monotheism has not produced any observable benefits. In the old days, if the rain god or the crop god or the fertility god didn't do right, you knew exactly who to complain to. Now you have to complain about the whole universe, from global warming to bank bailouts to acorn community organizing, just to get heard. There's a case I might mention for polytheism. If you have 365 gods, every day is a holiday.
Oh, there you go.
In our Constitution, the word in the First Amendment is religion. No law respecting an establishment of religion. The phrase is not a religion, or the religion, but religious doctrines or dogmas in general, which are prohibited by being established by governments. This is an important distinction. Non-establishment is broader than merely one church or ecclesiastical organizations. The founders were thoughtful men, and they did not choose the word religion over church without careful thought to its meaning. Madison noted that throughout history, quote, superstition, bigotry, and persecution have accompanied the union of religion and government. He noted that Christianity did not need the support of government in order to flourish. This is an important point to remember when somebody shouts out about original intent. Owing to Tom Paine and the general intellectual movement of the times, the Enlightenment, and a distaste for the existing systems, our founders reached back to ancient Greece and Rome, pagan civilizations, for inspiration about democracy and a government based on the common man. We were in Philadelphia a couple Mondays ago visiting Independence Hall. Almost every delegate had books on Rome and Greece on their desks when writing the Constitution between May and September in 1787. Having discarded the notion of divine right, they had no intention of allowing a new set of religious doctrines to take over. The divine right of kings notion had prevailed from the earliest days of Christianity and arose from earlier pagan philosophies that rulers, by virtue of their being rulers, were obviously favored by the gods. This divine right notion not only gave kings legitimacy in the eyes of the church, but allowed that whatever religion the king had, everybody else had to have too. Kings loved the idea, of course. But almost all the language in the Declaration of Independence is to refute the church authority in rulership. This is where we see inalienable rights granted by the Creator to ordinary humans, disputing the supposed superiority of the kingship class that had been supported by the church. The Declaration of Independence is equally for independence in both government and religion. It had to be so. Divorcing the king meant divorcing the king's religious authority. I mentioned before that the Declaration of Independence was not based on the Bible or commandments. In fact, it was in direct opposition to churches and religious hierarchies. There's not a single phrase in the Bible that offers a model for the Declaration of Independence. Well, I'll skip ahead here, it's getting long. But one of the most brilliant ideas of the founders, probably James Madison, was the idea of an independent judicial branch. This too was a radical departure from the European systems the founders were aware of. Under the divine right notion and the hegemony of the church, there are actually two different court systems: normal civil and criminal courts under the king, but also church courts. Church courts dealt with cases of heresy and blasphemy, as well as clergy misconduct. There are no checks and balances on these courts at all. This issue was visited only a few years ago when the Catholic Church in Boston had the chutzpah to argue, they actually argued in courts, that our courts had no power over priests, that priests would be judged only by the church's canon law courts. This self-serving position was summarily rejected by the U.S. federal courts, which was a ratification that constitutional law trumps church law. Some people assert we are a Christian nation. We are not. We are a constitutional nation. And look how successful separation of church and state has proven to be for the churches and churchgoers in this country. We have more churchgoers, more denominations, and more money donated to churches than any other country in the world. All the evidence shows that the secular constitution has been extremely good for religiousness and religiosity. You know that they've heard loud voices claiming that Christians are being persecuted and that their beliefs are under threat of extinction. I cannot take them seriously. When I drive down the street, almost every corner has a church with a prominently displayed cross. It is absurd to think that Christians are an endangered species. I do note that churches always have lightning rods. This shows a lack of confidence. In fact, the Christian right are thriving and flush with political power, and they have huge amounts of money and claim to speak for all Americans. Well, I think I should just wind up by saying it's refreshing now to hear that our president refers now to Christians, Jews, and Muslims and non-believers. But it is disturbing that even now, some 75% of Americans say they would never consider voting for an atheist. But I am confident. I think we the people is a beautiful and enduring idea. There is a viewpoint. No man or men can save this nation. It's time to put our trust in God or we perish. Or in another form, do we believe in the rule of God's law or the rule of man? Without God, we are doomed and the country will go to hell in a handbasket. The right wing is much enamored of this idea of collective punishment. These predictions of God's displeasure and desire to punish us Americans actually did happen. Bush got elected president. But I totally reject this idea. I think our Constitution reminds us to do like the delegates did in Philadelphia 227 years ago. They did not sit around waiting for prayer or scripture or rapture. Our Constitution was made for we the people, not for deities. It is up to us humans to cherish and defend it. Various gods can fend for themselves quite well without help from hairless apes. I'm a strong supporter of separation of church and state, and I think public displays of piety for public gain does an evil purpose in public and demeans our personal values. Although I do have to recall Texas Governor Miriam Ferguson, who blithely proclaimed, "If English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it ought to be good enough for the children of Texas." I don't think we need a national prayer breakfast. I don't think every speech has to end with "God bless America." I don't think we need to have faith-based government offices that spend $2 billion a year without any accountability. The word secular means without regard to religion. It means doing good government independent of religious authorities. Is secularism a religion? Is non-belief a religion? The Catholic bishops maintain that these are competing religious views, and we cannot let them get away with it. I do not agree with priests, preachers, televangelists having any moral authority whatsoever. Secular humanism is about humans, without regard for angels, heavens, hells, divinities, cherubim, seraphim, demons, satans, ayatollahs, popes, etc., etc. So we ought to be clear. Non-belief is not a religion. Not collecting stamps is not a hobby. Or as Bill Mayer put it beautifully, abstinence is not a sex position. You know, I think when I look back on my life and the things I did and the things I did not do, I think of the beauty that I experienced in high mountains, in remote places on the planet, with friends, with music, and with humanist thinking. I think separation of church and state is beautiful, and it is more important than having convictions as a non-believer. Atheism is valuable as a personal orientation in life, but separation of church and state is for all of our society. It is both political and social and personal. Non-belief cannot survive without strict separation of church and state. Politically, religious displays are a kind of spiritual taxation, if you wish. In what way is any part of the business of government for a town council to have a prayer? And in what way is it part of the people's business to select one particular god, one religious tradition for an act of worship? Nothing I ever did in my life was by me alone, and so it is for all of us. We gain our individual strengths from our collective strengths. Without the ACLU and my parents and teachers and friends, our family would not have accomplished the milestone we celebrate here today. And sometimes we were simply just lucky. So I'll conclude with two statements from the Supreme Court decisions of Schempp and the Engel one I just briefly glossed over. Children are not noted for their resistance to the forces of social suasion. This reminds us that children in schools are especially vulnerable. And in the Engel versus Vitale case, was decided in 1962, having to do with the New York Board of Regents prayer that was required in New York's public schools. One sentence is memorable from that decision. It is no part of the business of government to be composing prayers. And this reminds us to always ask, what is the proper business of government? It is no part of the proper business of government or politicians to be promoting religion in any form. This is what separation of church and state and secularism actually means. So I thank you very much for listening.
We'll be doing about a 10-minute Q&A. So if you want to come up and ask a question, we have Griffin and Shannon at each microphone. They'll just ask you questions. And if I may kick off with a question, my first question is, I'm always inspired. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm always inspired by people who go from when they learn of something happening that they don't agree with, they believe violates the Constitution. They go from saying somebody needs to do something to I need to do something. And I'd like to know what made you go from thinking that somebody needs to do something to I will do something.
Well, I had the good fortune to be with a bunch of really good kids in high school, and we had a Thursday evening discussion group. We talked about various ideas, and I was confident of their support. I was confident of the Unitarian tradition. Unitarians became Unitarian Universalists in the course of time. I was confident of my parents' support, and my father had been very much involved in supporting the ACLU during the height of the McCarthy era, which everybody could see was a tremendous injustice and threatened all kinds of dissent and all kinds of alternative thinking. So I was the recipient of a long line of traditions, I think, that gave me particular confidence. And I didn't mention that I had, in high school English, we had to do a lot of writing and thinking and reading. And there was a wonderful book by Edward C. Lindemann and C.S. Smith called The Democratic Way of Life. It's now out of print. We have a copy around here. And it presented a very idealistic description of democracy in terms of liberty, fraternity, equality, and the role of the minority, the loyal minority, and how that was essential, protecting ultimately the majority. So these were all important inspirations in my life.
I had occasion to review the CBS reports that was made only a week or two after the Supreme Court decision. And I must say you came out very well in that. Congratulations. But I was struck at some of us had
a copy of Carl. That's
yes, right. So I was struck by the difference in thinking of what I would call the intelligent set of the time. Could you comment on that? Do you perceive a difference in the intellectual thought of today versus the intellectual thought of that time?
I think one of the things everybody recognizes is that the country has become far more pluralistic and far more diverse than it was in 1960 or 63. And since we've come to understand much better the civil rights of ethnic minorities, that extends naturally, I think, to better understanding or more tolerance for religious minorities. But the process is far from complete. I mean, we know that there are people out there getting big attention by claiming this is a Christian nation and why do we have to tolerate all these jerks? I don't think there's been too much in the way of intellectual evolution, but there's been a whole lot in terms of social thinking and social acceptance. And you know, when I got a copy of the Quran in school, I didn't know a darn thing about Muslims. This is purely by accident. I had heard of it. But now everybody knows thinks they know at least a little bit about Islam. And you know, many people have run into Asians that have different religious outlooks and world perspective. So merely getting to know African Americans, merely getting to know Asians, merely getting to know atheists, all changes our perception. And this has been one of the great successes of the LGBT movement. When people actually began to meet people who said, I'm gay, and it turned out that they didn't have horns and a tail, that everything was didn't seem nearly as bad as it used to when it was in the abstract. So I think just the mere rubbing of shoulders with people who are different from our little tribe, whatever that tribe might be, the tribe of atheists, tribe of Unitarians, tribe of Jews, tribe of Methodists, that always enlarges our understanding.
Growing up as a Jew, we always knew that we were not Christian. Anyway, every year people would say to me, are you ready for Christmas? And finally I said to somebody, why do all Christians assume that everybody does the same thing? And he said, well, you know, we brought that to America. I said, yeah, but you brought slavery here too. He didn't answer me on that. But I wanted to say, I'm in the NAACP. And every night, every time we have a meeting, they start, and there's always a Jesus prayer. And I was hollering separation of church and state, and they had no idea what I was saying until I said, how would you feel if somebody was up there saying, Allah, Allah, Allah? And all of a sudden, like a light bulb goes off. But I want to tell you, my granddaughter is black and Jewish. She was training for something. They were talking about something with the Muslims, and she said, well, they should have a place to do it. And the teacher said to her, how did you found Jesus? And she said, no. She said, I'm Jewish. And the teacher said, no wonder you have those liberal views. Anyway, I'm in the ACLU. We call the ACLU. We went to a court case and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to ask you, in today's world, do you have any other suggestions of ways to handle this? Because it still comes up all the time. Maybe only because I'm a Jew, or maybe because I hear it or see it or feel it, or, you know, you have some more suggestions of how to deal with people that just assume everybody should be Christian. Thank you.
Well, there's no magic bullet here. Speaking out, of course, and reminding people is that you're a perfectly good American citizen anyhow, and you can have different views. And besides that, religion ought not to determine our politics, not to determine our civic positions on things. You can decide whether you like nuclear power or don't like nuclear power based on science and reason. Evidence is what counts, not religious view.
Like everyone here, I'm sure I want to thank you for your courage and your life commitment. I'm wondering, you mentioned your relatives, some of them were a little embarrassed perhaps. How did having the name of a major court case, Supreme Court case, how has that affected your life? Has it affected your career? When you go from job to job, do people know what the case was? How has it been to be the person whose name is behind this case?
Well, I never put the court case at the top of my resume. It actually hasn't affected it very much at all. I mean, for many years I was busy doing physics and geology and having fun and pursuing a career, and the issue hasn't gotten really very, very powerful for many years. The last serious attempt to get a constitutional amendment was Ronald Reagan in 1989, and that failed. And and it was also extremely important that organizations like the ACLU, Americans United, American Humanists had grown up. So you can't fight every battle yourself. You need organizations, and that's why I urge you to support them, because they can carry on in areas where none of us have the strength and energy. So I can't say that it very much affected me, but I've always been, and I didn't actually have a very large role to play in speaking out on it until I retired, and then I was happy to take on the position of being kind of elder statesman on the subject matter. I am happy to be on the Speakers Bureau of the Secular Student Alliance, because I enjoy meeting young people in colleges and universities around the country, and because that's where the future is. I'm not going to be on the stage that much longer, so it's the younger folks that need to carry on.
While you were victimized by the laws of the legislature of Pennsylvania, I have an anecdote to share. I was victimized by the Maryland legislature, like Murray family was. I grew up in Maryland, and my father died right before I turned 4. And 2 years later, in 1961, I entered the Maryland school system in the first grade. And we stood up and we started to say the Lord's Prayer. And every morning we were required to say the Lord's Prayer for first and second grade. And as you know, the prayer begins, Our Father who art in heaven, Our Father who art in heaven. And every time that was said, it reminded me of the death of my father. But I was not a believer. I didn't believe in heaven or hell. And so it's just a matter of these laws, these religiously based laws have not just the obvious impact, but sometimes some unintended impact. And that stuck with me all through these years, and was a part of my being concerned about these violations of church-state separation. So glad you took care of Pennsylvania. Madalyn Murray O'Hair dealt with Maryland, but everything is still shaky because of new attempts to bring religion into government, particularly here in Pennsylvania recently.
Yeah, there's always new attempts. It's just amazing that the religious right and the evangelical community wants to keep reopening these issues and hoping that somehow things will be different. A couple of years ago, I was thinking that the religious right was waning. It turned out that I was very badly wrong. So eternal vigilance is the answer. I am amused that, the flag salute, there are a lot of young people in the country who started all of a sudden asking on Facebook, who was Richard Stans? Richard Stans. Well, it's our flag. The nation, it represents the nation for Richard Stans. It shows you that patriotism by rote isn't always very effective.
I'm wondering what your grounding in biblical and religious scholarship is. Here's what you have a very strong constitutional argument, and I'm very sympathetic to that argument as a member of a minority religious group. And in regards to the extensive biblical satire, I'm not exactly humorless either. I enjoy biblical and all sorts of satire, but as a piece of friendly criticism, I suppose, there's tremendous sophisticated research and thought on Bible and on religion.
And it's all a lot of nonsense. Look, there's a body of intellectual endeavor, and I put that in quotes, called apologetics, in which people parse and reparse and reinterpret and try to extract some meaning from this. And it's just a bloody waste of time. The Bible has no particular importance. It shouldn't have any more importance than any other book written 2,000 years ago by a bunch of goat herders who had very little understanding of the world around them, didn't understand even their own lives, and to try to impose some monotheistic God ritual on top of to help them do it. I mean, I'm perfectly well aware that in caveman times, it was very important to have a tribe to protect you. No man could stand up against the forces of nature without a community around you. And so I understand something of the interpretation of that. But to imagine the Bible deserves some special respect, some special understanding, some special mental masturbation in order to interpret it, I think is just utter nonsense.
There's tremendous continuity in regards to human nature and
the human nature argument, yes. The Catholic Church talks about human nature and natural law ad infinitum, and you read this stuff for pages and pages, and you ask at the end of it, what the hell have I learned? Because it has no evidence on it. There's no concept of looking for evidence and observing the natural world and then drawing conclusions from it as science does. There's nothing that's remotely good in the Bible in terms of understanding the natural world. It's all this mental, spiritual, blah, blah, blah.
Let me just say, as someone who spends a lot of time and energy engaging and bringing people together into interfaith dialogue, I would say, well, what I tell everybody, do not compare the best of one tradition with the worst of another. And do not compare the best of one tradition with the worst of another. And I would say, depending on how you understand then what faith is, that a stance that there is no God, for example, is a faith stance. Actually, with as much certitude as fundamentalism.
Oh, I've never said that there is no God. What I have said is that the concept of God is totally irrelevant and unworthy of further discussion. I don't care if people believe in God or not, as long as you don't draw ridiculous conclusions from it. I have no quarrel with religion, except for what Daniel Dennett in his book Breaking the Spell calls toxic religions. Religions that demean the human spirit, religions that actually wind up hurting people. And a lot of the traditional religions have a great deal to apologize for that about, because they have hurt people over the years, either in sexuality or in some other dimension. So, but I don't care whether people believe in the Bible, whether you believe in Plato, whether you believe in Socrates, whether you believe in Archimedes, I don't care. It's the conclusions you draw in terms of the way you live your life and the way you treat other people. And of all the people who read the Bible or to treat all the other human beings in a good way, I would say applause. Unfortunately, that's not the case.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
But I do thank you for the question.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here. My forefathers came to this country as slaves. It's ironic that you would be here this evening talking about the Constitution. We weren't part of that. So I have to step away from that. All I'd like to say this evening is, or with you, I'd like to say the LCU is supposed to be so important. What are you going to do for the minorities that are getting in so much trouble with the Constitution today? Thank you.
Well, I'm not one of those who worships either the Bible or the Constitution. The Constitution is really quite marvelous, but our founding fathers got slavery wrong. There's no question about it. They were wrong. They were wrong the way they treated Native Americans. This whole notion of counting people as 3/5 and all that, it was wrong. But the beauty, there is a bit, is that there is a kind of self-corrective process. And morality has in fact evolved. We do in fact learn things. We are not bound to keep treading in the wrong paths of our forefathers. We can think again and evaluate anew. And I think that's one of the important messages of religion, frankly. It's one of the important messages of Unitarian Universalism, that you don't have to be bound by the mistakes of the past. But to I don't want to apologize for the Founding Fathers. They were merely creatures of their time, as we are creatures of our time. And we're probably making mistakes too. But I think it's a little bit of a source of pride for us human beings that We did abolish slavery. We are abolishing persecution of gays. We have greatly diminished anti-Semitism. We did give women the right to vote. So the idea that we are caught in the past is something we should not mire ourselves in too much, and remind ourselves that there's always new horizons that we must reach for.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say, because of course, the groundbreaking case that you were involved in, now one of the rallying cries of the religious right is that they don't allow prayer and Bible reading in schools. And of course, that's not completely true. They don't allow government-led Bible reading and prayer.
Precisely.
And so I wonder, are those in the religious right actually ignorant of that fact? Or do they just not realize that if their child is not praying and reading the Bible in school, it's because their child chooses not to?
Well, there's a lot of willful ignorance, and this is one of the reasons I always ask people to read the court decisions in their entirety and not just rely upon blog accounts or newspaper accounts. When these important decisions about the Defense of Marriage Act and the Proposition 8 come out of the Supreme Court in this next week or two, you'll see a lot of misstatements or misinterpretations of them. So read the decisions, even the ones you don't agree with. You'll find them amazingly well written. So when they say, the Supreme Court kicked God and prayer out of the schools, that's really nonsense. It's wrong. What they said, as you correctly quoted, that you cannot have government-authorized, government-sponsored. You can't use the power and authority of the government, and therefore the schools, to impose these kinds of prayers. That's a violation of the Establishment Clause and could well be a violation of the Free Exercise Clause. I will say that I'm not entirely in favor of freedom of religion. That sounds a little shocking, of course, but we have to think carefully what we were talking about. I mean, we do know that there are distinct restrictions on how you can practice a religion. You're not allowed to have animal sacrifice. You're not allowed to have child sacrifice. You're not allowed to have a prayer meeting in the middle of a freeway. So there are limitations, and we ought to recognize that. And then when it comes to, for example, the Catholic bishops insisting that they have, and Catholic business owners insisting that they have a right not to provide health insurance for contraception in their employee plans, I think that's wrong. If we think that these are child labor laws are good for society, just because you're a religion, you don't get to violate them. If you believe that everybody should have a good health insurance program, just because you're a religion doesn't mean you can violate them. So I'm not entirely in favor of freedom of religion. We have to recognize that there are limitations where the good of society, the larger society, takes precedence. I forgot where I was going to go with that. but kids do have the right to come to school 15 minutes before and pray. Kids do have the right to go to a Christian prayer group after school, right? They simply cannot do it with the authority of the school to impose a religious devotion or a ceremonial use of religion. The Supreme Court, in several decisions, particularly in Abington, made a point clear that there was nothing in their decision that prohibited the reading of the Bible in history class, in philosophy class, or even having courses on religion. But relatively few schools have actually wanted to do this. It's very interesting. When some rather progressive school districts suggested that maybe they would have a course on world religion or comparative religion or whatever. You will find these in colleges quite frequently, of course, but in high school rather rarely. Well, it turns out that the interfaith communities, for example, have generally not liked this because, for rather obvious reasons. The Catholics don't want their kids hearing about Protestants. The Protestant kids didn't want to hear their kids to hear about Muslims. The Muslim kids didn't want to hear about Buddhists. Right? So each one wants to be protective of his own, and therefore the idea of comparative religion and study of religion in an objective, secular way it was something that most people felt anathema or very uncomfortable with. So in fact, there's only a handful, maybe a couple dozen schools in the country that offer, high schools have offered something in comparative religion. But nothing, and I've always said that nothing on this planet will ever stop a kid from offering up a prayer before his algebra exam. But as an ex-teacher, I can tell you that doing the homework and reading the books is better preparation for the exam than prayer.
Thank you, Dr. Schempp, for your presentation. And also thanks to everybody who came out for this and for our questions. I just wanted to mention two things for everybody in case you weren't aware. There are right now 2 legislative actions going on in relation to the 50th anniversary of this court case. The first one was announced early last week by Representative Mark Cohen. H.R. 351 is currently been referred to the House Education Committee, and what it does is it declares the month of June Public School Religious Freedom Month, and in direct honoring of the result of this case. It's in the House Education Committee. We're not sure how far it's going to go or if it's going to get legs. Obviously, an option open to everybody is to contact their legislator and make sure that they are aware of it and aware of your opinions on that resolution. But there's also a bill in place that was announced on Friday, I believe. House Bill 1511 repeals the section of the Public School Code of 1949 which requires schools to lead the daily readings of the Bible. I don't know how many of you know this, but it's still on the books. It's only been superseded by the Supreme Court. It hasn't actually been taken out of law. So since this month is the 50th anniversary of that decision, we felt it entirely appropriate to try and see if we can't get that law repealed. And again, Representative Cohen is spearheading that effort as well. And we would ask people to contact their legislator and let your legislator know how you feel about that as well. So again, thank you everyone for coming out. I really enjoyed the talk by Dr. Schempp, and I really want to thank him for coming down and sharing with us today. And there is a reception at Lori Lebo's house at 5 o'clock. That's in an hour and a half. There's some slips if you're interested in attending that have directions on them. So see Lori or myself, and we'll be happy to get that information to you. We can mosey down right after we feel like it. In an hour. Okay, so about an hour or so. So there, over here we have slips. So if you are attending that, please pick that up. Anyway, thank you very much. Oh, and on either side here is memorabilia from Dr. Schempp from the time period in the court case and everything. If you want to look at it, feel free.
That would be helpful. Crystal banner. Oh, yeah. Banner in the bar.